The day monsters came to Del Sol Elementary, a story about acceptance and tolerance, written by Stephanie L. Morales, illustrated by Alexander Gonzalez. One beautiful summer morning, George was getting ready to go to Del Sol Elementary for his first day of 5th grade. It was only 7 a.m. and he was having a horrible start. Teddy, his puppy, had made holes in his favorite socks. Vanessa, his older sister, took 5 million hours again in the restroom. George hated how the first day of summer school was already going all wrong. On his way to Del Sol, he saw a small round purple monster strolling along. George had almost forgotten that this was the first year his school was allowing monsters to attend classes with human students. He had heard stories from other kids about how dangerous and scary these creatures were. Finally, one of them was standing right in front of him. George skated faster to catch up with it. The little monster could hear the skateboard's squeaky wheel growing louder and louder. The closer George rolled toward this creature, the stranger it appeared. It had 6 eyes, strange hair, and very large teeth. Its purple soft skin could be noticed from far away. It didn't look scary, but George knew this monster could not possibly be good news. With a mischievous grin, George began to shout mean names and hollered, "Hey, short stuff, how's the weather down there?" The monster kept its head down, said nothing, and simply continued walking. It ignored everything that was being shouted. George then uncapped his water bottle and began squirting the creature with cold water. But the monster never stopped to confront these attacks. George did not like the idea of monsters attending his school and became furious when that creature entered room 39, the same room he was in. Before entering, George paused outside of the classroom door as his mind began racing with thoughts. Why do we have to share our school and our playground with monsters that don't belong here? They were not born on this side of town and don't know a lot about how we do things at Del Sol. They're just here to take over our school. But when George walked into class, he was suddenly frozen with unbelief. His eyes became wide and his mouth dropped open as he felt a chill run down his back. He struggled to catch his breath and felt like someone had knocked the air out of his chest. In front of the class stood the creature with 6 eyes, strange hair, large teeth, and purple soft skin. He began to speak and calmly said, "Welcome to room 39. I am your teacher, Mr. Aberbobbin, but you may call me Mr. A. Please take your seat." George felt a huge lump in his throat and sweat began to drip from his forehead. He felt his face instantly become as hot as the sun and wanted to disappear. Thoughts about what he had just done began to race in his mind while he looked at his empty water bottle. George looked around and rushed over to a seat that was in the very back of the room. "Maybe Mr. Aberbobbin won't notice I'm here," he hoped. Next to George stood Nestor. This monster was very tall, had blue feathers, a beak, and his feet were sharp claws. George looked disgusted as he saw this creature stand up. This was just too weird and looked unnatural to George. He had forgotten that the teacher was taking attendance until he heard, "George!" George froze and did not make a sound, wishing he was not in the class. "George?" Mr. Aberbobbin called out again. Finally, George stood up very slowly and muttered the word, "Here." "Speak up, young man," exclaimed Mr. Aberbobbin. He took a deep breath and exhaled the word, "Here." As George looked up at his teacher, Mr. Aberbobbin slowly said, "Ah, you are George. Please set your skateboard in the front of the room, here, next to me." George hesitated and clutched his skateboard tightly, his feeling of disgust towards Nestor quickly turning to anger against Mr. A. He knew the teacher was punishing him for what he had done earlier that day. George looked down at the skateboard he had begged his parents to buy him on his 9th birthday. It was special to him because his father told him that it was made by the best skateboarder in the world. Mr. Aberbobbin sternly said, "Bring it here, now." George clutched onto his skateboard tightly and slowly walked to the front of the room. Mr. Aberbobbin pointed to a corner and said, "You can leave it there." Filled with boiling frustration, George thought, This is why monsters should have never been allowed to enter my school. Monsters take things that don't belong to them, and they don't like humans just as much as we don't like them. He placed his skateboard in the corner and angrily walked to the back of the room. During the rest of class time, George stared at the floor and could not wait until the day was over. Not long after, an echoing buzzing sound rang throughout the school. It was the bell. Time for recess. It was obvious that the monsters and humans stayed away from each other on the playground. This was a good thing because monsters are dangerous anyway, thought George. He walked over to the rails where he usually did tricks on his skateboard, but saw Nestor using his rails. Monsters should not be using my rails, sneered George. As Nestor began to do tricks, a crowd began to gather around. This was the first time humans and monsters stood near each other on the playground. They all watched in amazement the tricks that Nestor performed. Unamused, George rolled his eyes to show everyone that he was unimpressed. However, he could not hide his feelings once Nestor began to glide through the air with his skateboard. The tricks that he did had never been done before, at least not by a human. Nestor's feathery arms allowed him to stay in the air for a longer amount of time. Because of this, his flips, twists, and turns were much more impressive. The buzzing sound of the bell filled the air once again, and students began walking to class. On the way to class, Nestor walked next to George. "Hey, you're George, right? I saw you with a skateboard today. How long have you been riding?" asked Nestor. George ignored the questions and kept walking. He had made his mind that he was not going to talk with these strange creatures. He thought, maybe Nestor's trying to get close to me to eat my brains later on, or to follow me home to hide under my bed. The day continued, and it was time for Mr. A to explain the assignment for the day. "Humans, today you will partner up with a monster for the rest of the day and learn as much as you can about your partner. Learn about the things that make you different and the things that make you similar. It's important to ask the right questions." George had a smirk on his face and said, "Mr. A, I have a question. When are you and the other monsters going back to Monstein Elementary?" All of the humans laughed, but Mr. A was not amused. He simply said, "George, you still do not know how to ask the correct questions." For the first time, George had seen Mr. A's eyes filled with sadness. He knew monsters were mean and angry, but had never imagined them feeling any other emotion. "Nestor, you will be partners with George," Mr. A instructed. George turned to look at Nestor and thought, this monster will probably try to eat me before the end of the day. He did not want to be partners with this creature. He knew Mr. A made this decision because he hated him. First, Mr. A took a skateboard, and now he was forcing him to be partners with a weird student? This day was going from bad to worse. The bell rang once again to be dismissed for lunch. Nestor called out to George and said, I saved you a seat." George ignored this loud voice and kept on walking. He heard laughter and chatter throughout the cafeteria. He could not believe his own eyes. The world had gone mad. Humans and monsters were actually sitting next to each other and talking about their assignment. Had humans lost their minds? Wondered George. These monsters were taking over their school and humans did not seem to care. But George decided to be strong and stand against this madness. Once lunch was over, students were free to talk about their assignments out in the playground. George had not seen Nestor around, which made him very happy. Suddenly, from a distance, George saw Nestor running from the classroom in his direction. George began to run the opposite way, but no matter where he went, Nestor would call out, "George!" George couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and screamed, "Leave me alone! You're weird and strange and I don't want to get to know you. Get away from me. I wish you just went back to Monstein Elementary." Nestor froze in his tracks as his eyes filled with tears. All of the students stopped to stare at both of the boys. Nestor appeared to be stunned, did not say a word, and he quickly turned around to run back into the classroom. Everyone was now glaring at George, but he did not care what others thought. He was happy to finally get rid of a dangerous creature. 15 minutes had passed and Mr. A's footsteps could be heard from a distance. His eyebrows were lowered. In a serious tone, the teacher said, "George, meet me in the classroom now." George suddenly felt a bit scared and thought, oh no, what do monsters do when they're mad? Should I scream for help? When he entered the classroom, he immediately noticed that his skateboard was gone. All fear had left his body and anger took over. What did you do with my skateboard? He bellowed. Mr. A did not say a word. Give it back, you mean monster, George exclaimed. Mr. A continued to remain calm and did not say a word. Without wanting to, George's eyes began to get watery because he knew his teacher had gotten rid of his skateboard for good. Monsters are all the same. They ruin everything. Finally, after a long pause, Mr. A spoke. I hear you had a few words to say to Nestor. Would you like to share what that was all about? George looked out the window and frowned. Nestor wouldn't stop following me, so I made sure he got my message to stay away from me. George felt a sense of courage by saying this to his teacher. Mr. A looked straight at George and let out a big sigh. The first time we met, George, you also made your message clear. Your empty water bottle sitting on your desk is proof of that. George looked down and became nervous, not knowing what Mr. A would say next. Did you even ask Nestor why he was following you? Questioned Mr. A. Because he wanted me to get to know him, mumbled George. That is incorrect, young man. I asked him to tell you to come into my classroom because your skateboard was ready. George became confused. Ready? He asked. When we met outside of the school today, your wheel was squeaking. I was looking at your skateboard the entire time you decided to share your passionate thoughts with me. I noticed the back left screws were loose. This is why I asked you to place your skateboard in front of the room so I could fix it. George felt like it was getting hard to swallow and hesitated to ask, after what I did to you, why did you fix my board? Because that's what monsters do. We help those in need. We are not the bad guys. We do not treat others as if they are less. The world has been taught to fear monsters, but that's only because they don't know us. Humans have believed the lies that have been told for many years. People say that we hide in dark places just waiting to pounce. They think we're mean and want to gobble them up, but this is not true. When are you going to open your eyes, George? We are the same. We just look different. George reflected on his behavior and began to feel ashamed. He realized he had become the monster humans had always talked about. Nestor's outside riding his skateboard alone. You should go join him, Mr. A insisted as he handed George the skateboard. For the first time, George looked at Mr. A with eyes that showed a genuine sorry heart. With a big grin, Mr. A said, "Get going, kiddo." George quickly walked out of the classroom to find Nestor. Nestor dropped his skateboard and took a step back when George drew closer. George was surprised when he saw fear in the eyes of his classmate. I can't believe Nestor's afraid of me, he thought. Please don't leave. I just want to talk, begged George. I want to say sorry for treating you the way I did. I'm sorry for everything I said. All you have shown me is kindness, and I know I was too stubborn to see the truth. Nestor looked at George and took a few steps forward. I knew we would become friends eventually, he exclaimed. I knew it from the moment I saw the matching A on your board. George had never noticed that the bottom of his skateboard had an A on it, and didn't know what it meant. Don't you know this A is from Aberbobbin Monster Skateboards? Asked Nestor. George gave a confused stare. These skateboards were created by the Aberbobbin Monster Company, said Nestor. I learned all of my skateboard tricks from Mr. A. George's mouth fell open and was shocked. You mean Mr. A made my skateboard? Nestor nodded. He didn't just design each board. He owns the largest monster wheel shop in the world. I thought everyone knew that. The bell finally rang for all students to be dismissed. But George did not want to leave. He had so many questions and felt like he needed to find out more about Nestor and Mr. A. Where did they come from? Why hadn't they come to Del Sol sooner? What tricks did they know? As George was passing by room 39, he asked, Mr. A, who are you? Mr. A smiled and said, George, that is the question that really matters in this world. The question that can begin a conversation to finally bring monsters and humans together. Let's just say I became a teacher to change the world, one skateboarder at a time. Now get going, kiddo. We can always talk tomorrow. Later that night, George was in bed and could not wait to go to school the next day. Nestor was going to teach him new tricks, and George was excited to learn about his new friend and his new teacher. As he laid on his bed to go to sleep, he could not stop thinking about his day at Del Sol. Mr. A is the coolest teacher I've ever had, he whispered as he closed his eyes. I can't wait to go to school tomorrow. I will never forget this day, the day monsters came to Del Sol Elementary.